A U.S. Supreme Court ruling forces Illinois lawmakers to put a proposed redistricting amendment on hold. The fatal shooting of a Chicago police officer sparks new scrutiny of Illinois' Safety Act. And still no action yet on legislation to keep the Chicago Bears in Illinois. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, May 1st. We'll look at those stories on this edition of Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Cast. I'm Peter Hancock and I'm here again this week with my colleagues Ben Szalinski and Brenden Moore. It was a busy week at the State House where the Illinois Senate came back into session while the House took a week off. One measure that everyone had their eye on was a proposed constitutional amendment that would have rewritten the rules for how Illinois does congressional redistricting. That measure passed the House the previous week, and it needed Senate action to get on this November's general election ballot. But all of a sudden, the Senate hit the pause button, which effectively killed the measure for this year. Ben, let's talk a little bit. What happened with the redistricting amendment?
Yeah, so after that Supreme Court ruling, Senate President Don Harmon and the Democratic caucus, they held their weekly private meeting, but in that caucus meeting, they discussed that amendment and what it meant for the state of Illinois after the Supreme Court ruling that basically said you can't draw district boundaries solely based on race. And you know, it would have been interesting to put an amendment in the Illinois Constitution that the Supreme Court that same day essentially just said you can't consider race when you're drawing districts. You can't solely draw a district based on that. So ultimately, Democrats in that caucus meeting, and I think largely at the advice of their legal counsel, came to the conclusion that it was better to hold off on putting this amendment on the ballot this year and then trying to figure things out later, because the Constitution is not exactly a flexible document.
Yeah, so we just went through this process ahead of the 2022 elections, or after the 2020 census. And if you look at Illinois' congressional maps as well as its legislative maps, I mean, people have called it the most gerrymandered congressional map in the country. And one of the ways that Democrats justified it was by saying, you know, people get too hung up on looking at shapes and whether or not districts are compact and square and everything. That they were more concerned about the fact that these maps produced a racially diverse congressional delegation. I mean, they're on record as saying they considered race and they wanted a racially diverse, ethnically diverse congressional delegation. So put that in context with this Supreme Court decision that came down this week.
Yeah, I think that's the question we're all still trying to figure out is what do those statements mean, you know, for the future of Illinois' map. But I think one of the things that, you know, Democrats can take away from this thing is there's no prohibition on political gerrymandering or anything. And, you know, some of the craziest looking congressional districts in the state, you know, sure, they certainly keep a lot of, you know, racial groups together in some of the cities. But if you look at the 17th congressional district, Illinois' 13th congressional district, both of those pick up, you know, a lot of the urban areas of the state outside Chicago. They're ultimately, at the end of the day, they're designed to elect a Democrat to that seat. So, you know, the Supreme Court didn't say there's any prohibition on political gerrymandering. And I think, you know, as much as Democrats have kept race as part of, you know, the criteria of drawing these maps, have referred back to the Federal Voting Rights Act as the reason they keep, you know, race considerations in mind when they draw maps. You know, I don't think it handcuffs their ability in any way to draw a map that is still entirely gerrymandered to benefit their own party.
And the Supreme Court's decision essentially says you can do that as long as you don't call it race, if you call it politics. And they even kind of acknowledged that there was kind of a partisan, how do you want to put it, a racial element to partisanship. So as long as you don't say you're trying to do it by race, that you're doing it by partisanship, everything's okay.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, as far as Illinois' constitutional amendment goes, there wasn't a lot of urgency to put it on the ballot this year. Yeah, we heard from Chris Welch, the Speaker of the House, that the reason this amendment's even being proposed is because the Supreme Court decision could come down. Came down 5 days later, but it's going to be a little while before Illinois redraws any maps. We're already through the primary process here. There's not going to be new maps for 2026. Maybe they could do that for 2028 or something if they want to further gerrymander as other states are doing. But, I think ultimately kind of the way that folks are looking at it, at least in the Senate, and Senate President Don Harmon is the next time we're going to draw maps is 2031. That gives Illinois voters two opportunities in 2028 and 2030 to weigh in and put some sort of redistricting amendment into the Constitution. So ultimately, I don't think time was an important factor here. And I know there are some Democrats in the General Assembly who are not happy that the Senate did not proceed with this. There are some senators who aren't happy and would have preferred to proceed with this. But I think at the end of the day, it doesn't change a whole lot for Illinois politics, for Illinois maps. Gives them more time, and we'll see more effects of this, I think, 5 years from now.
Well, Republicans openly were the ones who challenged these new maps in federal court, claiming that they were politically gerrymandered. Does it look like there was anything in this decision that could give them possibly a new opening to challenge the existing maps, or have we heard Republicans talking about that at all?
Yeah, I don't think we've heard specifically Republicans talking about getting rid of this current map because of this Supreme Court decision. I know, Peter, you covered a lot of this back in 2021, 22, when there was lawsuits challenging some of the racial components of these districts. But, I think ultimately, from a Republican point of view right now, they're happy to see the Senate punt on this constitutional amendment that they believe would just green light gerrymandering in the state of Illinois, very obviously. So I think it'll be interesting to watch kind of how this argument evolves. But the most recent challenge that the Supreme Court, this Illinois Supreme Court evaluated on redistricting that Republicans filed, they threw it out because it'd been 5 years since we drew the maps, and they said it's too late. You're going to have to suffer through this map for the next 5 years until the end of the decade. So in a lot of ways, I think the current map and Republicans' arguments and gripes with it is put to rest even after this court case. But, if they can, I guess, find some sort of compelling evidence that, a district here in Illinois was drawn illegally only based on race, maybe they can move forward. But I think one of the challenges we have here in Illinois is it is a Democrat state where Democrats are pretty successful in elections, kind of regardless of, any gerrymandering. We see that at the statewide level. Louisiana Republicans have more success in certain congressional districts in statewide elections. So, even keeping communities of interest together, there's districts in this state that are white majority and still elect Democrats too.
Okay. Well, switching gears now, I want to talk about another case. On Saturday, April 25th, two Chicago police officers were shot while they were guarding a robbery suspect that they had taken into custody and taken to a hospital. While he was being treated, the suspect, 26-year-old Alfonso Talley, allegedly pulled a gun out from under a blanket and shot two police officers, killing one of them. Officer John Bartholomew was fatally shot. Another officer was seriously injured. Most importantly for us, Talley was apparently free at the time on pretrial release while he was awaiting trial on a separate carjacking charge. He also had a long history of violent criminal activity, and that cast a spotlight on Illinois' Safety Act. That was the broad-based Criminal Justice Reform Act passed in 2021, and especially the provision that says criminal suspects are presumed eligible for pretrial release, the provision that eliminated cash bail. So that's now under the spotlight. Ben, what has been the reaction? I mean, obviously, Republicans have been calling for repeal or overhaul of this law for a long time. Did this case in Chicago, the shooting of two police officers, did that seem to have any impact on the debate in Springfield?
Yeah, it's certainly, another high profile case that brings the Safety Act back into the spotlight. A lot of cases that we've seen over time have been, the Safety Act has been blamed, but inaccurately in a lot of ways. I think this time it was a much more straightforward application of, a man who had a long, violent criminal history, had continued to reoffend even despite being on pretrial release, and was still granted pretrial release. And then the situation happened. Now, some folks say this is the law's fault. That's how Republicans will frame it. Other folks, like Governor Pritzker, have said this is the judge's fault because the law gives judges discretion. And at the end of the day, it's up to the judge to make the right call. 85% of cases roughly in Cook County, people who are let back out on pretrial release are not committing new crimes. But I think this case has gotten attention from both sides and even from some Democrats, I think. And as far as, taking a look at this law, seeing if there is a possibility for any sort of changes or evaluating the effectiveness of, the tools judges have at their disposal to evaluate whether a person is fit to be released pre-trial. So, at the end of the day, I don't know if it moves the needle on this issue in any way in Springfield beyond where it's at. I think both sides are very dug in, a couple of years now into this law. But, it certainly makes it back into this political spotlight. It means we're going to talk about this again, and there's going to be calls for reform. But, whether it leads to actual legislative action, I don't think that's a high possibility right now.
Well, there were calls for reviewing the law even before the legislative session got underway in January, and it seemed like there were some Democrats who were conceding that maybe there could be some tweaks to the Safety Act. Are there any serious legislative proposals out there being considered this session, either before or after this tragic incident in Chicago?
Yeah, I don't think there is, at least not from the Democrat side. I asked LG Sims, the main sponsor of the Safety Act in the Senate yesterday on Thursday of, what does this mean for any reform this year? And he said, I think what a lot of Democrats always say is that we are happy to take a look at any changes that are needed to the law at any time. So there's no concrete proposal, I think, that's being openly considered at this point in Springfield. A lot of where that discussion came from back in the beginning of this session back in January was there's a lot of concern that still exists to this day about the electronic monitoring policies in Cook County and the effectiveness of them, and even how they're being implemented, and the sheriff's ability to go get people who are violating their conditions of electronic monitoring. One of the things that Chris Welch, the speaker, was waiting to see before deciding about moving forward on Safety Act reforms was if the new chief judge in Cook County was able to implement some reforms to electronic monitoring through an administrative process in order to, mitigate some of these concerns. The chief judge's office put out a report earlier this year that basically seemed to indicate that there was fixes made to electronic monitoring through an administrative process that did not require the state lawmakers to get involved. And, I think in some ways that may have put to rest a lot of consideration for Safety Act reform here in Springfield. But, this case here has again highlighted potential issues with electronic monitoring. But I think the main question Democrats are going to be asking is this an issue that needs to be fixed at the judicial level within the sheriff's office, or is this something that we need to get involved in and change policies on?
All right. Well, finally, it seems like we can't end a podcast anymore without spending at least a little bit of time talking about the Chicago Bears and their efforts to get a new stadium. Turning to Brenden, last week, Governor J.B. Pritzker, who has previously been pretty hands-off about the whole Bears stadium issue, jumped into the fray and started putting some pressure on lawmakers to get moving, saying they needed to get some speed going in the game. So, Brenden, has there been any progress, and what's the state of discussions in the General Assembly about these so-called mega projects like football stadiums?
Yeah, so I guess channeling his top gun, Governor Pritzker has the need for speed, told lawmakers to get moving on the mega projects bill. Obviously, last week the House passed their version, although everybody knew it was going to need some work. The Bears said it needed work, Governor said it needed work. So the Senate was in this week, only for 3 days, and the bill did not come up. The lead sponsor in the Senate, Senator Bill Cunningham, kind of said at the outset that they would take their time, they would assess the proposal that was sent over from the House, and that they would decide how to proceed after kind of talking it through with the caucus. And they kind of view it as we don't necessarily have to get this done next week. We can work through our process. We are going to be in session until May 31st. That we can get this done sometime in the month of May. But they're not going to be bound by any artificial deadline that may be put on them by whether it's the governor putting pressure on them, or there was a meeting of one of the big committees at the NFL this week, a stadium committee, and there's apparently going to be another one in a couple of weeks where the Bears would have to provide another update. I'm not sure that is necessarily going to move the needle in the Senate per se, but conversations are still happening behind the scenes. One of the big things that was added in the House version of the bill was this property tax relief provision that would basically set aside 50% of the pilot payment for property tax rebates that would go partially into a statewide fund, but also to property taxpayers in the mega project boundary, basically, or within taxing districts within that boundary. So I guess one of the conundrums that they're working through right now is how do you provide property tax relief in one of these bills while also making this mega project tool an attractive one for both the Bears and also for any other larger developer that wants to build a big project. Because while I think a lot of folks agree with the principle of you need to provide, take care of your residential property taxpayers and show that we're helping out regular folks while even while we're giving a property tax break to wealthy developers, is that if you have that 50% in there, it could really spike the ask from local governments to the Bears or to any of these other developers, which may not make an attractive tool. So I think it's right now it's kind of they're trying to balance some of these priorities that are a little bit in contrast with one another. So the plane is not landed yet. They're getting there, but nothing this week, and we'll see when they're both back in session next week.
Well, in the meantime, there is this counter proposal from the state of Indiana, which has offered taxpayer money to help build a complex just across the state line in northwest Indiana. Is that adding any sort of sense of urgency to the situation in Illinois, or are people just kind of, just letting that sit there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kickstarted things earlier this year. This pilot proposal kind of languished behind the scenes, kind of in the dustbin, development hell, if you will, for 3 years until Indiana kind of got into the fray. But in terms of over the next few weeks, I don't think that lawmakers are going to feel particularly moved by it. I think the general idea is if they don't get anything done by the end of session, that it's looking a lot more likely that the Bears would go to Indiana and become, as Governor Pritzker called them, the Hammond Hams. They're going to be the Chicago Bears for as we all know. Like, they're not going to change their name. But in terms of they have to pass something like next week, I don't think that I think the Bears are gonna punish them if it takes a couple more extra weeks, or it's going to be the end of May. Because I think the one thing that Illinois has going for it is that the Bears want to be in Illinois. They want to be in Arlington Heights. That much is clear, because if you were just going for the best deal, I mean, Indiana's offering at least $1 billion in public subsidies for stadium construction. Illinois is not offering that and not going to come close to that. But the Bears are an Illinois institution. They own the land in Arlington Heights. A lot of folks, if you just talk to economic development people, will say that that site is a far superior site to the Hammond site, which is kind of close to a lot of industry and a little bit out of the way, kind of not in the median heart of Chicagoland like Arlington Heights is. So I think there are a lot of advantages to Illinois, even if the deal is not necessarily the best on paper. But I think the general thought is if lawmakers can pass something that's acceptable to the Bears, Governor Pritzker signs it by the end of May, that there are probably going to be shovels in the ground in Arlington Heights sometime later this year.
Well, we'll keep checking back to see where that stands for the rest of the session. Meanwhile, that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. I want to thank Ben Szalinski and Brenden Moore for being here. On behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.